Welcome to Special Topics in Media. Dr. Garret Castleberry, professor of media production and communication at Mid-America Christian University, and the host of this lecturecast, a lecturecast where we examine culture, sometimes popular culture, but other elements of culture, one artifact at a time. And the great part of this programming strategy is both educational, informational, and also aims to kind of have a little bit of entertainment. We're aiming to approach these topics from a vantage point that invites people to engage with the subject matter rather than view it as, I don't know, off-putting, stuffy, right? We're kind of cutting the polarization out of these techniques. Well, we are kicking off an interview series that is specifically aligned with a graduate course we've been nurturing for a few years now, to kind of in the slow developmental phase. And I'm excited to bring the first of several guests on the topic of graphic design. And so this interview series will be in conjunction with our graphic design and portfolio management course, which is part of our communication graduate emphasis that students can take as part of either their MBA or ML. And we hope in the near future we'll be able to also broaden that even more. And I'm going to leave that message alone right there, kind of a teaser. And I'm going to knock on wood really quick. But joining me to discuss this conversation about graphic design, it would only be appropriate that we're leaning into and toward that world of graphic design. We're not just talking about it. We need to engage with those who work in and around it. And so joining me in this interview series is Corey Fuller. And Corey is the professor of graphic design and the chair of the Division of Art and Design at Oklahoma Baptist University. Corey, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on to talk about graphic design.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett.
Well, absolutely. You have worked in and around graphic design, and maybe if we wind back the clock, perhaps you could tell listeners or viewers a little bit about your educational background and maybe what pulls you into the world of graphic design more specifically.
Yeah. So I suppose going all the way back to childhood, I've always enjoyed drawing and sketching. But a lot of my friends, they like to draw comic book characters and weapons and those kinds of things, the things little boys are into, I guess. I was never really into those things so much. I always liked drawing letter forms, making logos for fake companies, those kinds of things. So then when I started college, I found out that there was a word for this, and it was graphic design, and just kind of fell into that. My first experience with computer graphics actually came with a Super Nintendo game called Mario Paint.
Mario
And
Paint, I remember
yeah,
this game.
yeah, it was cool. So, I mean, of course, you had the cassette, and then it came with its own mouse pad and mouse, and so you could do some low res bitmap graphics in Mario Paint, and I just fell in love with that. I've always enjoyed drawing with my hand, but I think I really fell in love with the idea of taking that and making it digital on a screen as well, and like the level of refinement you can have with that. So, yeah, I studied graphic design in college, and then I pursued an MFA in design after that at UCO.
Would you mentioned Mario Paint as an example. How
Mhm.
early were you when you maybe felt that shift away from the kind of hand-drawn imagery toward more technology? Was this a
Yeah.
gradual shift or
Well, I mean, I was sort of evolving with the technology. So, yeah, I guess sixth, seventh grade, I was playing in Mario Paint, and then I took a computer class, which is funny, that used to be a thing, and that entailed, building PowerPoints, or that's what we were supposed to be doing, and messing around in Excel. But I really went to Microsoft Paint and would play around in there, with brushes and draw things. And so I again just kind of fell in love with the idea of creating low res bitmap graphics. In the year 2000, that was the year I graduated. My parents got me a G4, which was, a top of the line Macintosh at that time. And that's when the Adobe, well, I almost said Creative Cloud, the Adobe Suite was on discs. And so you would load those in and load all
yes?
that software on. And I mean, I just fell in love with Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop, and those worlds were quite new, at
Oh,
that
wow. Sure.
time. So yeah.
You somewhat, if I'm not betraying confidence here, you fit into that micro category, if I'm not mistaken, of the zillennial, right? This kind of you're
I guess
on
I
the
am.
edge of the Gen
Mhm.
X
Yeah.
twilight and the beginning of this millennial countdown, and there's that kind of micro generation span of about 5 years where some of us are kind of existing in a void, but you're
Oh,
describing that. You're a non-digital native, but you were coming of age in this uh, period of considerable technological advancement, right? And then
yeah.
the kind of mass consumerification of it, where it becomes more mainstream, more
Yeah.
available, more affordable as a result. And we could say maybe it's converging with your creative strengths at just the right time.
Yeah, one
Well,
one thing I'll point out on that topic of coming of age in that particular generation, the pre-press class that I took in college, it was a traditional pre-press class. So we were doing masking with amberlith and rubylith, cutting it out with an X-Acto knife,
oh
uh,
wow.
using things like non-repro blue.
Hmm.
But then while I'm taking this class, I'm also masking in Photoshop and I'm building guidelines in Photoshop with blue, which is the non-repro blue. So yeah, I've truly seen both sides of that, which I don't know if that's helpful to my current students or not, but I understand the context from which we came.
Well, we've kind of established this ground level understanding that you had naturally creative talents that you put to use in both physical and then in some sort of technological means. At what point did this transition to become something you thought, "Hey, I can not only make money doing this, but I want to kind of make a living out of my creative strengths."
Yeah, so um, it is a double-edged sword doing something you enjoy to make
Hmm.
money. So,
Absolutely. Agreed.
yeah. So I'm still as a 40-year-old or well 40 plus now, but still trying to kind of figure that balancing act out. But I think in the culture at large, they do now fully realize the value of design.
Hmm.
Not just in terms of it can help your company make money, but you can make the world a better place through design. So you can make more intuitive interfaces. You can build things like forgiveness, into a design, knowing that people aren't perfect. So how do you sort of compensate for that with how you design something? Um, I live in a fairly rural area, and so sometimes you're still having to make that case that design has value because people assume you want to do this for fun,
Hmm.
aka do it for free, and then you have to come along and say, well, I'm designing this logo, but it has
Yeah.
value to you. And so, the idea of intellectual property is still a case I have to make that,
Mhm.
it's not just my time or my ability to use software. I'm offering you something creatively, but it's coming from nowhere seemingly, and that's why I think it's hard for people to understand how it has value because it's not like pulling oil out of the ground.
Mhm.
It's like these ideas, I don't know where they come from, but I just create these things, I manifest them sort of. It's like magic, and then I convey those ideas or those vectors, the end product to the client. And it is very subjective as to like how much value that really does have.
Well, you had a period of professional work in graphic design where you're out there at kind of corporate public facing, doing
Mhm.
work, developing your portfolio, and then you transition into a career in higher education. You've been teaching, you're a faculty member, and certainly growing administrative responsibilities. And how have did that transition come naturally, or did you feel kind of called back into that arena?
Yeah. So let me go back to my undergrad. I felt a certain call to ministry in high school, and
Mhm.
I didn't know how that would manifest itself really. And so when I was in college, I really thought I would go into youth ministry. So I probably didn't take graphic design as seriously as I should have. Uh, but anyway, I transitioned to grad school simply because I didn't quite know what I wanted to do yet with my life.
Mhm.
And I was sensing that youth
A
ministry
nice
probably.
placeholder.
Yes, right. youth ministry probably wasn't it, but I didn't quite know what to do. I knew that I loved learning and I loved college, and I thought, hey, let's do some more. So I got the opportunity to teach, as a grad assistant in my graduate program, and I taught vector graphics, I taught ad design, design basics,
Oh, wow.
and that I found that like really scratched an itch that I had that maybe I didn't even know I had. And so I just really fell in love with teaching college students and helping them to take whatever's in their mind and sort of again manifest that. And that's the most exciting thing to me about teaching.
Well, you've introduced a bevy of key terms already, right? Your terminology, your codex of understanding that field is deep, and it brings to mind a question about that maybe the transition we've been seeing in these disciplines. Art and art history represent a classical field of study we think about in the humanities, in the history of the humanities at many colleges and universities. Why have we seen graphic design emerge, if not supplant the focus on those traditional forms of art or art history?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So yeah, going backwards, just to set context, I was a graphic designer for a bank, which is a very commercial entity.
Hmm.
And so you can see graphic design fitting in as sort of a professional degree, but it also seems kind of like an art degree. So a lot of times the ethos of a program is sort of made evident in how they structure their curriculum. So some programs are very design heavy and they don't use the A word, they don't use the art word.
Hmm.
Other
Sure.
programs, such as ours, and we're very integrated with art and design.
I think a lot of states have outlawed art now, actually, in the state constitutions. If I'm not mistaken.
Maybe maybe
I'm going to need a fact check on that. I'm going to send the intern out for that right now.
Yeah. But like for instance, in our program, we have history of art 1 and 2. We have
Hmm.
history 3, which is non-Western art that's optional. All of our graphic design majors take a history of graphic design class. And I think that that works against the mindset that only what is currently happening is what matters. I think that's something we really need to resist. And so we need to
Sure.
understand that as modern, as contemporary practitioners, we are still fitting into a context. So the typefaces that we use come from somewhere. They come from an historical model, and we can look at the old style of typography, and we can look at the transitional period to the modern period. We can look at slab serifs and sans serifs that we now use almost exclusively on digital devices, and those all fit into an historical timeline. Also, we tend to think of this dichotomy between fine artists and graphic designers, and that hasn't always been so clear cut. So Henry de Toulouse-Lautrec is a well-regarded painter in the canon of art. He was also a commercial artist. And so you also have, Art Nouveau illustrators, painters, Art Deco painters and illustrators, that their artifacts, what they created, are as valuable as fine art now. So those are being purchased at auction, for instance. So I try to really encourage my students to not think about graphic design just as commercial art. It's not just meant to sell something,
Hmm.
in the marketplace. It has value. It is material culture in a way that's on par with art. Now, the distinction we always make is fine art tends to be more expressive, and design tends to be more didactic, more pragmatic, and it's usually communicating the voice of the client rather than the artist's individual voice. But they will have a style that's invested into it.
Well, when you describe the didactic or what you call it, client driven types of graphic design, this gets me kind of thinking in parallel with another field, architecture. And now
Right.
the field of architecture requires a study of a lot of math to be able to kind of conceptualize and develop, models that meet certain specificities that are safe, right, and so on. um, and how important is a familiarity background with math when practicing or teaching graphic design? What is their relationship like?
Yeah, so I mean, it could be something as simple as determining aspect ratio. So if I
Hmm.
make this at this size proportionally, how would it size up? It might be something like the resolution of a screen that you're designing for, or the dot gain of a print piece that's going to press to like a 4-color offset press. So those things are important to know. I think one place where math might come in is if you are sort of delving in, it's a relatively new branch of graphic design called information architecture.
Hmm.
You're taking data and you're thinking, how do we communicate that visually in an interesting way to show trends or patterns or correlations? So an understanding of mathematical concepts and even statistics could be abundantly helpful in that regard.
Well,
Another
we've
one
been,
more. Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
no,
Well,
no,
and one more thing also is just gauging the success of a website you've designed or an app that you've
mhm.
designed and sort of looking at those analytics and identifying some trends and some maybe pitfalls there as well.
Well, you mentioned websites, and we live in this creative period of the digital age, as some would say, and millions of people are now expressing themselves through relatively artistic means in virtual spaces, right? And how do you incorporate, say, digital media and social media into teaching lessons or project assignments with students? What does that relationship look like when studying graphic design in the social media age?
Yeah. So I think there is a tendency and even in academia to say, here's how we do this. But
Mhm.
that implies like we should be doing this, right? So my approach, I think, more is to take a step back and say, well, what does 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 hours of screen time doing to a person,
Sure.
every single day? So much of our lives are mediated through these devices.
Mhm.
I show a documentary that's very old and dated now, but it's a frontline documentary called Generation Like.
I've
And
seen this. I've
have
seen
you,
this episode. Yeah.
but it's almost better now that we're like 10 years removed from it because we can see
Mhm.
how some of it was prophetic and then how some of it was kind of silly.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, the idea of sort of conveying your personality and building a brand online and a persona online. I mean, in the history of humankind, like that's a relatively new idea. And so I think we have to think, well, is this good or is this bad? What does this do to our self-esteem, particularly for young people? Um, I'm not like a Luddite. I mean, I think you have to embrace technology, you have to embrace culture, right? You can't just resist all of it, but think about ways that we can use it responsibly and leverage it for ultimately flourishing. I mean, that's the whole idea is human flourishing. So, in what ways do our technologies harm us? That's a good question. In what ways do they allow us to flourish? But yeah, in design, I mean, you're never going to design something most likely just for print. Yes, there are old school print designers that probably do, but me, I'm always thinking, how do I take that concept, turn it into video or turn it into an interactive piece? That's just the reality that we find ourselves in.
When you describe harm just now, and you're talking about maybe our modern tendencies and how we may manipulate and utilize technology, it makes me think of a lot of the kind of intersection between graphic design and even something like AI. And we're in this period of deep fakes and manipulations of information, visual information that persuades people. And so it makes me think about maybe the ethics, graphic design or art ethics that have to be taken into consideration, which are updated conversations that I guess we must be having.
Yeah. Yeah. We actually just had a faculty development event on AI and Chat GPT. Of course, that was kind of tilted towards how do we keep students from taking advantage of this and pulling a fast one on their old prof. So,
Sure. Well,
but I
I
mean,
mean,
yeah, but it does lead to some interesting conversations on how powerful is the AI, in what ways
mhm.
is it tilted, how are you structuring the algorithm that it's built on, in what ways does it become godlike, and then drawing comparisons to like, okay, a human can do this, the AI can really only do this. And this is the trouble that it would have with sort of behaving in a human kind of way. But there have been people that have won photography contests. I mean, photography, right? So you're supposed to
Mhm.
capture light. That's what that would
Mhm.
mean. But they have generated this image with AI prompts. Now, in one case, it wasn't like found out. It was the artist, I guess we'll put that in air quotes, sort of saying this was AI generated, and telling the judges that, he had pulled a fast one on them. So those are really interesting conversations as well. So yeah, the idea of just entering like an illustration or a photograph or even a logo into a contest, it's going to be moving forward very hard to tell what's real and what's not real, or what was generated by AI or human hand.
And maybe it requires simply a multiplication of divisions, right? This understanding, well, what is an artificially designed photograph or photographic image, a series of pixels versus what is a natural light, I guess, which is it's all manipulation of light and image through technological means. And so
Yeah,
perhaps it just that multiplication of divisionality will allow us to find the conversation points to see what plural categories can exist. Well, we're talking about this use of digital tools, and with many tools more affordable and thus more accessible now, and think about things you already described your interest in the Adobe. Now it's called cloud, but I can remember when we were buying the software, downloading it, onto hard drives and so on, and running it and running out that memory and RAM and all that stuff.
yeah,
Some contend that the need for quote unquote education in art or graphic design is now outdated and unnecessary. And
yeah.
how do you, working in that field yourself, how do you approach encouraging people that are skeptical about that, the value of academic study of art and graphic design?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to your point, we are experiencing a democratization of software and hardware. I mean, it's
Mhm.
relatively inexpensive now. I mean, we're making a podcast right now with relatively inexpensive technology. So there's been a leveling of the playing field, which in some ways is really nice. In other ways, it's kind of like the Wild West. So I mean, we saw this to some degree in the early 2000s, but the internet was not what it was now. And
Mhm.
so we're having sort of a new reckoning, I think, in our new paradigm, more fully immersed in a digital lifestyle. Um, so I suppose the case I would make is, well, one would be, I don't know if 18-year-olds are truly ready to enter the job market, right? So now
Yeah.
that's me being an older person and sounding a little bit, parental. So I think there's value in sort of a 4-year maturation process, in terms of understanding the technology, but also just kind of growing up. I can't imagine going out and doing work for a real client like right out of high school. I just don't think it would work. But there are, I mean, tons of online resources. Like if I want to learn Procreate, I can look up YouTube videos. If I want to learn Adobe Illustrator,
Mhm.
same thing.
Mhm.
So, but I think what we're doing in a institution is we're showing again that context. We didn't spring up from nothing. We're fitting into a story of art or a story of design. I teach in a particularly liberal arts university and a Christian liberal arts university. So, I mean, our classes are kind of structured in that way that it assumes some knowledge from the Western tradition. So they're taking classes in history and literature. And so, when we get to the point where we're talking about, Russian constructivism, I don't have to go and explain communism. They're going to somewhat, hopefully, kind of understand, communism's influence in the world.
And
Uh,
hopefully if they understand it too well, you will turn them in like
that's
you said.
right. That's right. I do actually make a point. I love Russian constructivism. It's really rigid. It's all red, black, and white, and
Mhm.
just the typography and the imagery. It's all like really powerful, and I love it. But I always say, like, I'm not a commie. Just to clarify. So,
I used to, well, there was this casual phraseology of in grad school where studying communication studies, the field, the discipline, the shorthand for a period was we were referencing one another as commies. And I say I use this pastime language. I think with like now culturally or unable to aspire to such humorous corners of the universe. It's too we're too frail a society for wit and sarcasm to function in that light, especially in Western areas. Well, let's talk about misconceptions, right? In terms of how things shift over time. What other misconceptions might the average person have about the labor or rhythms of a career in graphic design? What dispel some myths for us.
Okay. So I think to your former question, we do fit into an historical context. So I try to discourage students from just picking fonts just willy-nilly, or milli vanilli even.
Yeah.
Um, Picking color schemes just arbitrarily. So,
Mhm.
understand that colors say something. They sort of evoke certain ideas or moods or feelings. Typefaces can say a lot. Just with the typeface, if it's Helvetica or if it's Baskerville, those have
Mhm.
almost embedded meanings into like the forms of those faces, and it kind of informs the message as we interpret it. I used to work with a person. She was a really nice person, but she said something that always drove me nuts, and she would sort of write a lot of the body copy for our brochures on our website, and then she would pass it to me and she would say, "Can you make this look pretty?" And I
Mm.
was like, "Oh," which I mean, maybe that was a compliment. I did make things look pretty, but I think we like to think of ourselves as problem solvers.
Mhm.
We are bridging a communication divide. So I would prefer solving problems to making things look pretty. Another misconception, a critique of design you often hear is something to the effect that graphic designers just make people buy things they don't need. You know, we're just sort of this facade, this surface, making products look exciting and sexy and stuff, and kind of contributing to the materialism of capitalism. Again, I would go back to what our function is, what our purpose is to create order out of chaos. So hopefully, as designers, we're actually making the world a better place. Now, sort of the irony is, a lot of designers go to work for ad agencies, and maybe are then adding to the clutter that they're trying to break through. So yeah, there are some contradictions probably, but the idea with design is to bring order fundamentally.
Well, I guess what when you think of your position, right? You're both kind of helping chair this division, but functioning as a faculty member, and you're bridging these worlds between art, education, professional labor, and so on. There's a lot of mentoring that would naturally go in that process. In fact, that the phrase apprenticeship or the term apprenticeship came to mind when you were describing that important period of maturity and cultivation, right? When young people kind of in that the traditional classical age group enters into collegiate setting,
Mhm.
and in this period, in the spirit of kind of apprenticeship, we start to think about sometimes higher ed can function as uh, providing doorways into opportunities. And this leads me to the question of how important is the process of strategic networking in the development of a career in this direction or this field, and how do they navigate those channels?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's pivotal. So, I mean, I regularly write letters of reference for students.
Hmm.
But in my role, I am teaching people to use software, but again, they can find that online in a host of
Hmm.
places. So
Sure.
hopefully I'm also offering some mentorship. A lot of times that is one-on-one. So, I mean, hopefully, I'm not just modeling how to connect the dots on a computer screen, right? I'm showing like how do you thrive, not just survive, but how do you thrive in this industry? And it is difficult. It's a very competitive industry. Some people enter the workplace and they might be working for like a copy center or a screen printer, doing some kind of like production work, but then they'll kind of move into more creative thinking. They might become an art director, a creative director, and those are generally the places we want to be. Um, but I mean, every job I've ever had has been kind of through a connection of someone that I knew beforehand, and I think design is one of those industries. It is so rooted in networking. Now, a lot of people are getting leads online, but a lot of those still are connected to our tactile world. So.
Well, what advice would you give to people curious about a career in art or really graphic design, but
Mhm.
perhaps they're unfamiliar, feel behind in terms of the steps necessary to move into this industry?
Yeah. So, I mean, for better or worse, you don't need to wait 4 years until you have that piece of paper that says you can practice design. You know,
Absolutely.
there are certain degrees where you have to have that accreditation, that certificate. Design is one of those things. I mean, you can practice it now. So, one of the things I always tell people to do is don't just assume the world. Don't just think, yeah, I guess this is this way, and we just kind of have to deal with it. Think critically, and that doesn't mean like just throwing stones, but think, how could we make this better? How could we improve this interface? How could we make this entryway more inviting? But people that have an eye for design, be it picking out their clothes in the morning, decorating a wall, thinking about how they sort of customize their own interface on their phone, those are all sort of the gateways. People that aren't accepting the world just as it is, but trying to make it better. People that drive down the road and see a billboard and think, wow, that type's illegible, or that font is way too small, or if they had done it this way, that would have been so much better. They're just constantly thinking about, how do I solve problems? And then
Mm-hmm.
sort of putting that into action. I mean, getting some training in a class that you would offer, or a class that I would offer, I think is also helpful, because that can keep you from having to learn all the lessons the hard way. Because again, that mentor piece is critical, because I've been some places and I can speak to some things and try to save people some trouble down the road. So
Well, you've described a lot of different, not only learning directions and objectives, and even some of the hazards that we might face in this arena, the different networks and channels and all of that, and even the mentorship that goes on in these positions. Like so many areas that you do kind of toggle in your duties, you do teach quite a bit, and you have a rich history of classroom experience. What is your current subject area that you're most passionate about teaching? What class do you look forward to the most in recent years?
yeah, I'm going to sound like a politician. I'm going to get back to your question. Okay. I,
Okay.
I will, on the networking side. There is American Institute of Graphic Artists,
Hmm.
AIGA,
Hmm.
which is a professional guild. So there's the AAF, the American Advertising Federation. So Oklahoma City, and most major markets will have some form of both of those organizations. So particularly when you're young in your career, it's really critical to be involved in a group like that. Not just so you can climb the ladder, but so you can make meaningful friendships and find companionship and camaraderie within your field.
Excellent.
Um, Back to your question. Um, Typography is one of those obscure sorts of courses that when people get into it, they think, how is there an entire class just on letter forms? But then when
Hmm.
they're done with the class, they think, oh, wow, there could be two, we could, or three or four. And in fact, you can get an entire graduate degree in typography. Um, and so, I mean, that deals with a lot of history. A lot of times the history of type, the look of it is not just based on aesthetics or preference, but it's based on a technology that did or didn't exist. So for instance, the wood type poster style that became so popular between the 1850s and the 1900s in the United
Hmm.
States, sort of that old west kind
Yeah,
of
that old west font. It's kind of
look.
long.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that came from just the practicality of not wanting to move all your metal type out west as you were traveling on, a wagon or whatever. So,
Mm.
or even by train, I suppose. But the idea of where we have trees, we have wood, and we can make wood type. And so that led to a lot of embellishments, because they were literally carving those wood
Oh
blocks.
wow.
And
Yeah.
that's why a lot of those posters, you only see uppercase letters, you don't see the lowercase, because it's less to carry, if you're just dealing with uppercase forms. So like the hat show print style that's real popular in Nashville, that comes out of that tradition. It's still contemporary and looks cool. Yeah, so type design is of great interest to me. Thinking about how you lay out a page, be it digital or for print, that makes it easy to read and almost something that people don't have to think about. So the metaphor I always employ when I teach that is, if you're at a concert, you don't consciously think about the mixing board or the sound person unless it's bad. If there's feedback, everyone's like,
Yeah.
what's going
It's
on back
invisible
there?
until you notice.
Exactly. So, and that's really what type should be. Type should elucidate the message that you're trying to convey. So, yeah, that's probably one of my favorite classes to teach.
Excellent. Well, as we're winding down our conversation here, you've provided so many insights into this world, and we're grateful for getting to step into your mindset just a little bit. How might people contact you to sample some of your creative work? For example, is there a display that exists? I know you've held several public showings in the past. You've been able to do things like that, had specialty projects out there, or perhaps they just want to reach out with maybe questions about the field of art and graphic design.
Yeah. So I do have a website. If you just Google Corey Fuller, you'll get a professional football player who is more famous than I am. So usually online and for art purposes, I go by my full name. It's Corey, that's with an E, Lee, Lee, Fuller. So if you go to CoreyLeeFuller.com, you
Hmm.
can find a lot of my work there. I've got a show currently on display here at the university where I teach, and I try to have work out there, at various points all the time. But sometimes it's out there, sometimes it's not. But yeah, my website is probably the best avenue. I'm also on Instagram. It's at C, and that's SEE Fuller, at C Fuller.
Excellent. Well,
Little wordplay
Corey,
there. So.
Corey, thank you so much for joining us to talk about what it is you do, but even more than that, give us insights into the world of graphic design, its relationship to art and art history, and how these things fold together, how they're part of an evolution, and how they represent a specialized discipline worthy of study, worthy of investigation, and brimming with opportunities for students. Special thanks to Corey for joining us in this interview series with graphic designers and those affiliated for or in part of our graphic design interview series here on this season of Special Topics in Media.